Good morning. Well, this morning we're going to be chatting about the book of Obadiah. And if you had a chance to read it this week, it's like 21 verses. I think it's the shortest book in the Bible. So that's one way that you can kind of impress your friends by telling them how many books of the Bible you read if you just read the ones like Obadiah, because you can do it in about 3 minutes. Just a tip. But if you did read it, you might find that it's a bit of a difficult book. It's kind of violent. And God seems to be really angry in it, quite angry at this country called Edom. And it says, you can't even get to the first verse without hearing that God is so angry, he's assembling his army to attack Edom. And this morning, we've just been singing about how God is really loving and caring and with us in no matter what kind of a storm. And this can kind of somehow seem like it doesn't fit with what we know about God. He kind of seems angry and vindictive and a little bit scary, and then we can get nervous about that kind of a loving God. So how do you explain this book? You can all feel a little bit bad for Nathan this morning. He has to explain it to the kids in kids ministry. So I don't know how you would do that, so I'm glad I got you guys, because I think that's a little easier. But it's got to teach us something about God, because it's in the Bible. So what does it teach us? Well, we've got a few options when we read a book like this. The first thing we could do is read it and ignore it because it's a tiny, tiny little book in the back part of the Old Testament that everybody gets confused as to what order the books come in. Actually, I was at a library in the city looking at some stuff about Obadiah because I don't have a ton of books about that in my own office. And the guy at the library at CMU didn't actually know what order Obadiah was in. So he's like, it's in there somewhere. Just look it up. So you can kind of just ignore it. The other thing you could do is you could change your idea of God to be that scary, vindictive, angry God, and either just say, well, all religion is angry and violent, and just ignore all religion, or become an angry, scared, vindictive Christian who's trying to serve this angry God. Or you can do what I think we need to do this morning, which is figure out what it would have meant for the people who are hearing this book for the first time when it's first written, and then kind of translate that into what it means for us this morning. Because it can't contradict the rest of the Bible, which does say God's a good father. So then what is it telling us? So before we do that, let's pray and then dive into Obadiah. Heavenly Father, you are a good father, and we know that. We've experienced your goodness and your grace and your mercy. And so as we look at this book, I pray that you would help us to see you for who you really are, to expand our idea of who you are, to see you as so big, and then through that help our love for you to grow as we see the love that you have for your people. Amen. So the first thing we need to do in order to figure out Obadiah is to figure out the history. Because if you were listening to this book when it was originally read to the people, you would have known this history, so let's figure that out. First, we have Edom and Judah. These are the two countries that are talked about here. And the way that I like to think about it is Edom is a little bit like Saskatchewan, and Judah's a little bit like Manitoba. Yeah. So if you were to ask somebody from Edom, sorry, Ray. If you were to ask somebody from Edom, what's the best thing about living in Edom? They'd probably say it's not Judah. And if you were to ask somebody from Judah, what's the best thing about living in Judah? They would say, we don't have to cheer for the Rough Riders. So, Edom is a not important country. It's small. It's not particularly interesting. It's also not particularly big. The one thing that is a little bit interesting about it is that it was in the way. It was in the way of superpowers trading with each other. So Edom isn't a place that you go to. Edom is a place you go through on your way to Alberta. The one thing that Edom kind of had going for it was that, and so they kind of capitalized on it. So the big thing that they would do is operate toll roads. So if you wanted to go through their country, you had to pay them to go. And that was basically their industry, was paying people to go through their country. Judah is also not that important of a country in the grand scheme of things. It's small. Half of it has been taken away. They have a little bit different industry. They got some natural resources and stuff like that. But there's issues, and there's been tension between the two countries. They're kind of like, if you've ever been to visiting a family that you don't know very well, but you say something and then all of a sudden it gets really, really tense because you said something and it lit some kind of deep tension that's awkward, and now everybody's awkward because 17 years ago somebody said something to somebody else and that just reminded everybody of it. You've probably been in a situation similar to that. So that's what's going on with Judah and Edom. Because something happened hundreds and hundreds of years before this takes place that caused that. You see, before Israel was a country, Israel was a brother named Jacob. There were two brothers. There was Jacob and Esau. Esau was the old brother and Jacob was the younger brother. And in that culture, Esau, as the older brother, would get the inheritance, would get the birthright, and would get the blessing of the dad. Jacob wouldn't. But one day, Esau, who liked to go out and hunt, goes out to hunt and gets really hungry because he didn't find anything to hunt, and he sells his birthright to his younger brother for a bowl of stew. And then he goes out to hunt again, and while he's gone, his brother tricks his dad, who's on his deathbed, and he tricks him into giving him the blessing. So Jacob ends up with the birthright and the blessing, and Esau hates him, and Jacob has to run away from home. So you fast forward a few generations later. Now the descendants of Esau are now a country named Edom, and the descendants of Jacob are a country called Israel. And Israel are slaves in Egypt. They call out to God, and God delivers them through a guy named Moses. They're all wandering around in the desert looking for their promised land that God has given them, but they have to get through Edom to get to it. Because you have to go through Edom all the time, right? So the Israelites go up to Edom and they say, "Can we get through your country?" And Edom says, "No." And they say, "We'll pay you." And Edom says, "No. We'll even pay you if our animals drink any water along the way." And Edom says, "Here's our armies. What part of no don't you get?" And the thing there is, you would expect strangers maybe to be kinder than this, and these people are family, and they don't help them. So years go by, Israel eventually gets into their promised land, and eventually they get themselves a king named Saul. And one of the first things that we're told about Saul is he goes out to do some military work, and one of the first people he defeats, Edom. He defeats them, and that's in the book of Samuel, and then it mentions this guy named Doeg, who's an Edomite, and he gets a job looking after Saul's animals. And Saul gets to be really paranoid, and because of his paranoia and Doeg wanting to be really close to Saul, so he actually murders 87 Israelite priests and their families to kind of help out Saul. Eventually Saul goes and is not the king anymore. He dies, and then David becomes the king. And he also defeats the Edomites. He kills about 2/3 of them and makes the rest of them his slaves. So years after that, the country of Israel has separated into Israel in the north and Judah in the south. Israel gets exiled by people, takes them away. So now it's just Judah, and Edom is beside them. And then Edom gets their sovereignty back, and they get their own king. And then, because of the punishment of God against the Jewish people, Judah gets attacked by the Assyrians and taken away. And Edom helps the Assyrians. And that happens just before the book of Obadiah is written. So there's a couple of things going on there. But with this helping of the Assyrians, it's kind of like, you know those days when you've just kind of had one of those days, and the house is a mess, and the laundry's piling up, and you have just washed the floor, and it's still kind of damp. And you go to get a big load of laundry that you have to fold now, and you're walking through, and you see your toddler has climbed onto the counter and grabbed a big handful of chocolate chips. If you've ever seen a toddler, you can know how a toddler would eat chocolate chips. So there's chocolate going in his mouth, but then there's drool coming out of his mouth, and the drool is mixing with the chocolate, and the chocolate is dripping down his chin, and the chocolate is dripping down his clothes, and is dripping onto your clean, still, damp floor, and now he's walking in it, so he's causing little chocolate chubby footprints through your nice, clean floor that you don't have time to mop again. So you forget that you're super mom and always empowering of your children, and you yell, "Stop it!" At which point the older sister arrives on the scene, and she's going to help. So she does what all 3-year-olds do, grab the baby by the throat and haul him off the floor, yelling, "You are such a naughty boy. Mommy said no." So now everybody's screaming. And you have a choice here, kind of like Edom with Assyria. God has a choice. You have a choice. You can say, "Thank you, honey, for helping Mommy. I was feeling overwhelmed. I'm glad to know I have a helper like you that can discipline the baby for me when I'm having a day. I'm just going to go eat some chocolate myself in my bedroom. You deal with it." And you might want to. But generally what happens is everybody gets yelled at, everybody gets a timeout, while you remind yourself that you are Supermom, who is always empowering of your children. So the exact same thing is happening with Assyria, Edom, and Judah. Judah's being punished by God, but Edom doesn't have to help. But there's actually something more going on here, and we'll take a look at it in a second, but this isn't really a loving family trying to sort out discipline. These aren't 3-year-olds and 1-year-olds. How much hatred has to build up in your heart and in your mind when you see somebody being attacked, violently attacked, that you help? I mean, it's one thing to see stuff happening on the news miles and miles and miles away, but to welcome somebody into your country as a refugee and then hand them over to the very people that they're trying to flee? What has to happen there in your mind and your heart to lead to that kind of violence? And so this is Obadiah. As much as we can tell, it's a prophecy that was written for an actual service in a temple. And the people of Judah are hearing this after being attacked, and they know this history. The interesting thing is that sometime after this, Edom kind of drops off the face of the earth. We don't really know what happened. There's not a lot of information to tell us what happened to Edom. But within 100 years, there's no mention of Edom except that there used to be an Edom. There's nobody who shows up as an Edomite. They're just kind of gone. So it actually happened. So our question is, why is God so mad at Edom? It's laid out in 2 very distinct places in the book. We're going to read through those places. The problem is pride. They have, as by the definition of pride, they've moved God out of his place and put themselves in his place. They don't need God anymore. And that's led to disasters. But the thing with pride is that it's a tricky thing. And so let's take a look at what Obadiah says about their pride, and then we'll figure out what we can do about that. So Obadiah chapter, well, it's only 1 chapter, verse 1. This is the vision that the sovereign Lord revealed to Obadiah concerning the land of Edom. We have heard a message from the Lord that an ambassador was sent to the nations to say, "Get everyone ready. Let's assemble our armies and attack Edom." The Lord says to Edom, "I will cut you down to size among the nations. You will be greatly despised. You have been deceived by your own pride because you live in a rock fortress and make your home high in the mountains. Who can ever reach us way up here, you ask boastfully. But even if you soar as high as eagles and build your nest among the stars, I will bring you crashing down, says the Lord. If thieves came in at night and robbed you, what a disaster awaits you. They would not take everything. Those who harvest grapes always leave a few for the poor, but your enemies will wipe you out completely. Every nook and cranny of Edom will be searched and looted. Every treasure will be found and taken." That's pleasant. So pride shows up for us in kind of the same way. Here, the people of Edom are trying to protect themselves. They are protecting themselves not just from attackers, but they're also protecting themselves from God. And that's not a very safe place to be. Pride shows up for us in the same way, trusting in our safety nets, putting ourselves in the place of God to look after our needs. A few years ago, we went to a financial advisor guy who told us that we needed to have probably about $1 million saved up by the time we were 65 if we wanted to be safe. But then we would be safe from any eventuality. So really what we should do is make sure that we have our retirement stuff figured out so that by the end of our time working, we would have that much money in the bank waiting for us. So that we wouldn't have to be worried about anything if we had that much. Like we wouldn't worry about a thing if someone got sick, if anything happened. We wouldn't have to worry about it. Do you know how much stuff would have to go in our lives in order for that to happen? I'm sure it's possible, but do we save for retirement at the expense of God's kingdom? The other thing that we hear a lot is about family, and it's a struggle because you think, if I don't put my family first, if I don't give them 100% of my attention all the time, they're going to walk away from their faith, they're not going to like me, they're not going to be well-adjusted people, and the list goes on. But the problem is they haven't really seen your faith in action if all you've ever done is pour into them. It's sneaky. Pride is sneaky. Because saving money and parenting your kids are good things that good, responsible people do. And it's not saying you shouldn't be responsible, but there's an order. There's a proper order to it. God comes first. Showing your kids that your priorities are in the right order with God is the most important gift that you can give them, because it shows them that they're important, but God comes first. Your life of faith comes first. Pride says that it's your job to be an adult and be responsible and to make sure that you're in control. But when that pride comes in, it leads us to being on the wrong side of God's protection. Have you ever seen a parent at a playground with a kid? This nice, docile parent suddenly becomes like Mama Bear when somebody crosses her kid. The other day, we took the kids to the kids' garden in the city, and there's this this little creek thing that they have that kids can play in sand, and there's a grandparents there with their 10-year-old and 8-year-old grandsons who were building like dams and stuff in the water. And it was the funniest thing to see because this grandmother was going crazy every time this little 3-year-old boy walked near her grandkids' castle because she didn't want them to get wrecked because they were working really hard on it. So she would yell at the kids and she'd yell at the little boy who was just sitting there with his shovel. But she was protecting her grandkids, maybe not from a real threat, so it's kind of funny. But when there is a real threat, a good parent protects their kids. And just like God is protecting his kids, there's another side of the protection. There's another side of God's love. And the Edomites are on the wrong side. But there's a second way that Edom's pride shows up, and it's actually kind of interesting because I don't think it seems like pride at first, but it's called pride. So in Obadiah verse 10, it says, "Because of the violence you did to your close relatives in Israel, you will be filled with shame and destroyed forever. When they were invaded, you stood aloof, refusing to help them. Foreign invaders carried off their wealth and cast lots to divide up Jerusalem, but you acted like one of Israel's enemies. You should not have gloated when they exiled your relatives to distant lands. You should not have rejoiced when the people of Judah suffered misfortune. You should not have spoken arrogantly in that terrible time of trouble. You should not have plundered the land of Israel when they were suffering such calamity. You should not have gloated over their destruction when they were suffering such calamity. You should not have seized their wealth when they were suffering such calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads killing those who tried to escape. You should not have captured the survivors and handed them over in their terrible time of trouble." You see, Edom had justification for hating Israel. They had been slaves of Israel. They had been taken over by Israel. They were treated terribly by Israel. And so it might make sense that when a big enemy comes in, they help. But that's leaving God out of the equation. And that can happen with us too. It can be in our views about international or national events, or even just in our own personal relationships. When we get to a place where we believe that there is no hope, when we get to a place that we believe that we have to protect our own interests at all costs, whether that's something that's happening somewhere else in the world or in our own house. When we do that, we're saying that we don't trust God to change people's hearts, and we don't trust God to protect us. And ultimately, the people who've wronged us, we don't seeing them as being people that God created and is very capable of redeeming. That person in your mind that you think, yeah, but not them, God's very capable of redeeming them. And he wants to redeem them. But what happens when we try to control, and this is the end root of pride, is that we end up being afraid. There's only one reason why a small country with somebody who should be an ally, why they would start to attack. And that's fear. They fear the Jewish people, and they fear the Assyrians, because they have nobody on their side. So really what happens with pride is the end result is fear. There's another part of the Bible in Isaiah 51, especially it's really clear in the NIV translation, where God asks the question, who do you think you are that you're afraid? I think that's kind of an interesting thing, because there's the pride there, and then that showing up as fear. So we say things like, it's never been so bad in all of history. But there's pride there. So a few months ago, we do these staff training days at the church. And this one time, it was a couple months ago, Nathan had us do these surveys to figure out kind of how we're wired. And the guy that did them was talking about your energy. And it's not like a weird thing about energy. It was just kind of like how you're wired to serve in community. And so the author of the survey says that there's 7 main ways that people are wired, and that gives you kind of a general wiring. And then there's a way that it can go to the positive to help people in the community, and there's a way that it can go to the negative. And then that would be sin to show up when it goes to the negative. And it's actually a really fun survey. I really enjoyed doing it, and it's been really interesting to process it. It's something that we're thinking, we're wanting to incorporate for the teachers at West Park, and even there's another one that we want to do with the students in the high school, just because of how helpful it is to see how God has made you and be able to understand how to relate to him. But so we do this survey, and we were doing it on the computer. So you're answering all these questions and clicking buttons, and it's kind of fun. And then you hit the submit button, and you wait. And it comes up, and it says, your primary energy is power. I was like, oh, that makes sense. I'm powerful. That's awesome. And then it says, when used positively, you're able to empower others. So I'm like, well, that makes sense. Power, empowering, that's great. And it kind of fits with what I do, because my job is empowering the teachers and staff at West Park to lead and guide and mentor and teach the students. So this is awesome. Perfect. I am in the right spot. This is great. This is very affirming. Then I keep reading. When used negatively, you're susceptible to pride. What? I'm not proud. I am not a proud person, because a proud person would be, in my mind, probably a guy, who is not wearing a shirt and driving like an obnoxious car with probably big tires and maybe like a sticker of an energy drink on it, or some car part that I don't understand why you would put, like I have these kind of shocks or something, I don't understand, but something like that. Driving down the Crescent probably too fast with really obnoxious music playing that everybody in the entire town can hear, and taking selfies as he's driving. To me, that's pride. That's not me, not at all. My hair is always a mess. People talk about having a bad hair day. I'm having a bad hair life. And I usually have food on me, because my children think that I'm a walking, talking napkin and Kleenex. So I usually have things that are on me that are not clothes only. And nothing that I take as far as a picture of myself gets past my grid of acceptable to post on the internet, probably since I got married. In fact, my profile picture on Facebook is my cat. So I would say I am not a proud person, so this is wrong. This is clearly wrong, completely wrong. But then I started to process it. And I started to read about what he said pride was. And this is one of the things he said is, pride strips you of your community with other people and with God. That's what pride does. And I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. And then it says, because it doesn't allow you to be vulnerable. So at house church, I'd rather chat about theology, because then I don't have to talk about my struggles. Or I'd rather talk about your struggles, because then I don't have to talk about my struggles. And with God, I need to control things, and God is in control. So then we kind of jockey for position, me and God, which isn't great. So pride leads to me being alone, and pride leads to me being afraid. And then I watch the news, and I can't control that, and I'm afraid. Or I look at Facebook, and I can't control that, so I'm scared. And I wonder what the world is coming to, because things are getting really bad, like they've never been that bad ever, which is more pride. And the more proud I get, the more fear-filled I get, because I realize that the person in the center of my universe, which is me, is completely incapable of that job. And so I'm afraid. And then I try to get more proud to counteract the fear, and it just gets out of hand, and it just keeps spiraling. When I have a proper estimation of who God is and who I am, I get confident because I know that God is doing his job in the center, and he's very capable. My job is to be a follower, is to be faithful to what he's asking me to do. Then I'm on the right side of God's protection. Until we remind ourselves that the one in charge at the center of the universe is not me and it's not you, and until we remind ourselves that somebody is there who cares and knows, and instead of acting with pride, he acts with love, we'll be afraid. So we need to move back. The very last part of Obadiah talks about God's protection to people that have undergone his punishment. And look at the hope for these people in Jerusalem. They've been exiled because of their sin. But Obadiah 21, this is how it ends. Those who have been rescued will go up to Mount Zion in Jerusalem to rule over the mountains of Edom. And the Lord himself will be king. So I talked about the fact that this was part of a worship service. And if we focus just on the Obadiah section, we miss what the rest of the people would have heard in the worship service. And one of the things that they would have heard as well is another part of Scripture that they would recite over and over and over again. It comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6. This is what it says. Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. And you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your strength. That's what they would have probably left with. Not with the scary, violent passage in Obadiah. So what we need to do is we need to move back. We need to declare that we can't be the person who's at the center of our universe, that God has to be there, that the Lord himself needs to be king. I'm going to talk about a really practical way, but before I do that, let's declare that. We're going to sing a song, and notice the words that we're singing when we sing this, because it's not saying, I can do it all myself. In the middle of the storm, I'm pretty sure I can. It's saying, I am holding on to you. We are going to put and declare that we're putting God in his rightful place. And then I'm going to come back up and chat about something we've found that works for keeping him there. So let's stand and sing. So a few years ago, let me back up a bit. Pride is tricky because you can't keep a checklist and go, wasn't proud today, yes! Right? So it's tricky. So what do? A few years ago, it was a bit of a difficult season for me. There was some financial stuff going on personally that was tough. There was work stuff that was tough. Enrollment numbers were low at the school, and it was tough. It was just a tough season all around. And we had just started, I had gotten married, had a baby within 2 years, and trying to figure out, what does that look like? What does work look like now? What does home look like? How do you do this? Like, how do you do dishes? Like those types of things. Reminding myself, I do have an education, I have gone to school, I do know how to do dishes, that kind of thing. It was a really difficult time. And I went to a retreat that the speaker was talking about Sabbath as an antidote for pride. Let me tell you what Sabbath is. Sabbath is a regularly scheduled time for you to remind yourself where God is, at the center, in charge. He is king. Now, I grew up with things like, we don't wear pants because it's the Sabbath. We have to wear a pretty dress. And so I had this issue with things like that. But what he was saying is Sabbath is anything that reminds you that God is in control and is at the center of the universe. He is sitting on his throne and he reigns, and he doesn't need me to check my email, to look at the enrollment numbers, to check my bank account, to look at the real estate situation in Alberta, to whatever whatever I think that I need to do. He is in control, and I need to be holding on to him, not controlling it myself and stepping away. So I came home from that retreat, and I thought about that, and he encouraged us to not think about it as being super spiritual. He talked about it being something that was enjoyable, because we should enjoy the life that God has protected us for. So he talked about going out to his cabin and cutting down trees with a chainsaw. He says as soon as he heard the motor running on his chainsaw, he knew that God was on his throne and all was right with the world. I don't relate, but that's okay. I got the idea. So I went home and I started thinking about this, and I started thinking, okay, we need to do this, but we need to do this as a family, because I can't add one more thing into my life right now, and I need to add this as a family. So Kevin and I usually chat about important things while we drive, because it's when the kids are buckled in and they can't move. So we were driving down the road, and I was telling him about this speaker, and I was telling him about what we should do in our new plan. And he's pretty quiet. And so I said, it has to be something that gives you life, that reminds us both that God's in control. And no offense, it can't be with our families. I love your family, but hanging out with your mom and dad is not quite, to me, what I'm looking for with this. So then there was silence, and then I never know, should I keep talking? Is that going to make it better? Did I just make it really awkward? Should I be quiet? Should I ask a question? Should I not? So I'm thinking about this stuff being very, very quiet. He's very quiet driving down the road. Oh dear, did I? We're supposed to be honest. All of a sudden he says, I hate shopping. So we discussed this, we talked about it more than that, and we figured out one thing that we can do. And what we do is we defiantly put aside time regularly with our family. We defiantly go and put our cell phones away and focus on the fact that God is in control. We enjoy his creation that he's made, both the people and the rest of his creation that we see. We pack up the kids in the car, and we go to the zoo. We take the kids, and we walk through, and there's something defiant about that worship, because I can let the kids enjoy it. We can enjoy the creation that God's made. There's something about watching the polar bears in the tunnels, See his creativity all over the place there. See people from all sorts of different cultures with their kids, and we all have that in common. And it's worship. And it's reminding me that I don't need to check my phone. I don't need to see what's going on in Facebook. You can see the planes coming in and out from the zoo. And, people are moving, and the world is still turning, and God's in control, and I don't need to be. So my challenge for you for Pride is not to keep a checklist and be proud every time you can check it off that you weren't proud, but to find something that you can do that reminds you, that connects with you and your family, that God's in control and that you're not. And it's interesting to see how in that season, going to the zoo once a month, sometimes I just take the kids by myself when I was on maternity leave, I'm reminded of that. And so you can watch the news and you get scared after spending a few hours at the zoo because I know what I'm there for. I'm not scared anymore. I know where God is. I know that He's in the center and that I'm not. So my family, we go to the zoo. So my challenge for you is to figure out what your zoo is and to do that, because that's the best antidote for pride, is to remember where God is and where you are and what order that is. Have a great week, everybody, and we'll see you back here tonight at 7.